to another episode of Theology, and I don't have my microphone. Big giant microphone. Okay, yes, welcome to another episode of Theology, where I have my copy of the Confession and my nice cup of tea here. And so we're continuing in chapter 7 of God's Covenants with Man. But before that, I just want to just give an update about Gloucester Presbyterian. We had our first evening worship services last Sunday, and that was a huge, huge blessing. So thank you so much for all of you who have been following us, praying for us. Just keep praying that the Lord would add to our numbers, that we would be able to find a place to meet, and that the Lord would bless this work here in Gloucester. So with that, big thank you. And now we jump into the confession with section 6. And so we've been talking about the covenant of grace. We've been talking about how it has worked out in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant. And now we speak now about the New Covenant. Not that it's two different covenants, but rather differently administered. And so this part will really elucidate and help us to understand that. So section 6, under the gospel, when Christ the substance was exhibited, the ordinances in which this covenant is dispensed are the preaching of the word and the administration of the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, which, though fewer in number and administered with more simplicity and less outward glory, yet in them is held forth in more fullness, evidence, and spiritual efficacy to all nations, both Jews and Gentiles, and is called the New Testament. There are not, therefore, two covenants of grace differing in substance, but one and the same under various dispensations. So again, big paragraph there, but at its core, I think the two primary points, which is started at the beginning about, is simply that the confession has gone to great length to describe the covenant of grace, really the means of salvation in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And as Paul speaks of in Galatians, that the Abrahamic covenant, this covenant of grace to Abraham, preceded the law of Moses, and that all throughout Old Testament times and into New Testament times, believers come to faith by the working of the Spirit, uniting them to Christ. In the Old Testament, it was through types and shadows. In the New Testament, we have a much greater clarity. Well, the other big change that happened is that, again, as all the Old Testament cultic parts, parts of the temple, the sacrifice, all of those are null and void, if you will. They are no longer effective for their purposes. And in the New Testament, there's a greater simplicity. Here it speaks of we administer through the preaching of the word and through the two sacraments that Christ has given us, baptism and the Lord's Supper. And though they are, as the confession says, they're much more simply, there's a simplicity to them. But I do love the point here that though there's less outward glory, yet in them is held forth in more fullness evidences and spiritual efficacy. And note how the confession points out that they're more efficacious. They have a greater power, if you will. But it's also held forth no longer just to the Jewish nation, but to Jews and Gentiles. A great theme of the New Testament as we see the church growing, especially in Acts, as we have Jews and Gentiles coming together over the Lord's Supper. But in the Lord's Supper and baptism, there's a greater spiritual benefit, if you will, a greater awareness and a greater uniting us to Christ. And so the confession reminds us that though there's one covenant of grace, it has been differently administered, and there's a greater glory now that we are in the New Testament or this new covenant. So with that, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining me. And I do like this section of the confession. It is an important point to understand the flow and themes that predominate the Bible. So thank you.